We're going to be focusing on Parliament closely today. The House resumes. When it does, the Prime Minister expected to attend question period today, and he will likely face heated questions both from NDP and from the Conservatives on the government's handling over the ongoing protests in support of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. We know he did not make that trip off to the Caribbean. He's cut that short and is going to be there to deal with the matter today. Although concrete plan, as Janice McGregor was reporting, we don't know exactly what the government's going to do. He has not said, other than going to continue focusing on dialogue with all sides. What these next steps at this delicate time could and should look like. We have someone with an expert perspective to help us understand this so much more clearly today. Professor Michael Cole is an expert in law and Indigenous peoples and also dispute resolution. He's a professor at Western University in London, Ontario. And we're going to get to an issue with Professor Cole in particular here, because back in 2004, he was commissioned by the Ipperwash Inquiry to look at the whole issue of Aboriginal land claims and treaty rights in Ontario. So a particular expertise that I think is going to be helpful for us. Thanks so much for being my guest in studio this morning. We're going to hear later on, just about 2 hours from now, from the Assembly of First Nations National Chief, Perry Bellegarde. He's going to speak publicly to this issue for the first time, and we expect he's going to call for a mediator to be brought in. Now, I know that's something that really is an echo of something that you have been saying. Why is that the move, to bring in a mediator? Why is that the move to make right now?
A mediator can really help resolve a deeply emotional conflict. When emotions are high, it's harder to communicate, it's harder to be creative. It's also very helpful where there's a breakdown in trust between the parties. And as you know, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state has had its difficulties over the last 150 years. So having somebody at the table who can guarantee everybody there's a level playing field, a level table to talk at, all will be heard, and the values of each party will be brought to bear on trying to find a solution, can be what's needed to break the logjam.
So let's look at what form this could take, if that's exactly what, if that happens to be what the government does. Who should the mediator be? I don't know if there's a particular person you might have in mind, but perhaps what type of person?
Well, the main qualification is that they be somebody who's trusted by all of the parties around the table. So they should have a track record for integrity and impartiality. They should have an understanding of Indigenous perspectives as well as Canadian law, for example. But most importantly, they have to be somebody, well, who's a good mediator, but who is accepted by each of the parties around the table, because mediation is a voluntary process. When
you said Indigenous perspectives,
yes,
that's a whole extra wrinkle in this particular issue, I think, in that hereditary chiefs have a different view from the elected council. So how do you also at this table, well, on the issue of whether, you know, this pipeline should even go ahead, in particular this particular case, but how do you account for all the divergent Indigenous perspectives at this table as well?
So that's something that, of course, every society has divisions of view about how to move ahead, but that's a deep-seated problem that has been created historically because the Canadian law, Canadian government, kicked out hereditary governments in Canada in the early 20th century. So now we have two groups that have a legitimate claim to represent their peoples. In answer to your question, I think that's got to be up to the Indigenous people to find ways, perhaps from their own traditions, of resolving who should lead, who should be the voice for their community. And that could be something that could be a mediator, could be their own traditional approaches. Mediation is something that, for example, the Mohawks and the Onondaga and the Haudenosaunee used. The Gitxaala and Wet'suwet'en had their own process of working out leadership issues, but that will be equally important.
Do you think that mediation, I mean, based on where it's been used in the past, could be in this particular case what's needed, what could lead to a, you know, a solution here, or some sort of breakthrough?
I think it must be one of the main options, if not the main option that the parties are thinking about.
In the meantime, we're hearing from the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, Carolyn Bennett. She and her BC counterpart, they've issued a letter to the hereditary chiefs of Wet'suwet'en, and they want a meeting as well. Is that a good parallel approach to be taken, or are there too many disparate efforts going on?
No, I think it's good to try to involve everybody, and they're in different parts of the country. It may not be practical to try to bring everybody together. I think it's good that there are parallel efforts, and to the extent that the protesters at Tyendinaga are acting in part in solidarity with the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en, you would think that if the Wet'suwet'en chiefs find a process that they're happy with, that should help resolve the Tyendinaga situation or the concerns of the protesters at Tyendinaga.
So that concentration on dialogue obviously continues from the minister's office. That's coming from the prime minister. We have heard him say that's where his main focus lies right now. And yet he's been criticized very vigorously by some for not urging authorities or ordering, I guess, authorities to move in and bring an end to the blockades, given the tremendous economic consequences that we're seeing right now. What do you think of how the federal government has handled things to this point?
Well, I don't know what's going on in private, but
Right.
I think they're right. The dialogue has to be the first approach. That's one of the lessons from Ipperwash. The police SWAT teams were sent in at night to deal with a protest before there had been any investigation of the grievances of the people at Ipperwash. I was on a TV panel once with a Toronto Star reporter, Peter Edwards. He said that he learned in 10 seconds on Google that there was a burial ground confirmed by the University of Western Ontario there. And so the police didn't investigate and try to find out what was going on, and the government didn't before the police went in.
So just pause for a moment, because part of the reason to speak to you is because of your involvement with Ipperwash. I mean, Marc Garneau, the transport minister, has been just one to remind us of why it's a delicate situation because of Canada's history in situations like Ipperwash. And we look at some of the archival footage. This goes back to the 90s. It was a long-standing standoff in a provincial park over a burial ground, and it ended when the premier of the day, Mike Harris, in explicit, profane terms, told the OPP to move in and get them off the land, as in the native protesters. One native protester, Dudley George, was shot and killed, and this eventually led to the inquiry for which you wrote that research paper on Aboriginal land claims and treaty rights. So you know the story very well, and that was part of my question. Based on Ipperwash and what we know happened, what are the lessons to take from that to avoid this kind of a situation this time around?
Well, first, that it is important for the government to investigate what exactly are the concerns. Are there legitimate concerns that need to be talked about rather than dealt with through police action? And secondly, from Ipperwash, we learned that it can work to bring all of the parties around the table. At Ipperwash, there were two separate factions of the First Nations, Stony Pointers and
Kettle
Pointers, and we had them all around a table, and they were all committed to trying to find a solution. It's not easy. People have differences of views, but that's part of the solution too. If somebody who has a legitimate concern about the outcome, a legitimate right to be there, is excluded, then any solution that's found won't last. It won't be enduring. It'll be rejected by one of the groups. So that was a second lesson. The dialogue can work, and bringing in everybody who has a legitimate in the sense of that the Indigenous people, they have support amongst their Indigenous people. That's very important. So we need both of those things. But we had a mediator at Ipperwash, of course, as well. But so the police and the government, in my view, are right so far. I know there's an urgency to resolving these issues, but to at least try to see if there's a peaceful way of resolving it first.
The urgency, though, could lead to missteps potentially.
Yes.
What are the key things to avoid at what seems to be a delicate juncture in this story?
Well, overly quick action, obviously, escalating people's concerns. There are other groups around Canada who are watching this, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and we don't want, as a country, I think, to sharpen the divisions that are already there. So it's important that it be dealt with calmly, and yet, I know we need to resolve these issues with some urgency. There are Canadians who are facing
jobs,
a huge cost
there are
right
livelihoods,
now.
exactly.
Yes. So I would hope that all of the parties, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, have a sense of urgency. Can they create a process or agree to a future process to address the underlying issues that makes them all comfortable enough that they can step back at the moment? And secondly, and this is an important issue, I think, for the protesters at Tyendinaga, amongst others, can Canada commit to a longer-term, quicker and fairer way of addressing underlying land rights claims? British Columbia, the Wet'suwet'en never signed a treaty. They never consented to have people in their land. We've known this for a long time. The Supreme Court has ruled on this 30 years ago, and yet the process is grindingly slow. There has been no... So it's a current issue for the First Nations people who have land claims, who do not see anything changing on the ground for a long time. So some kind of commitments in the long term to address issues like that and issues of governance, I think will help as well. So you need those three tracks. Urgently, what can we do to de-escalate now? And then what can we do to address the particular grievance? And then are there underlying concerns that would help us avoid future protests in the future?
Professor Coyle, great to have you in this morning. Please come back again. Once we get the framework of whatever the next steps are, I think I'll have more questions for you then. I appreciate our conversation this morning. Professor Michael Coyle here with me in studio, an expert in Aboriginal law and dispute resolution at Western University in London.